At this inaugural Distinguished Speakers series, which is sponsored by Powers and Women at NTU. My name is Kimberly Klein, and I will be hosting today. So before we get started, I just want to make a couple of little housekeeping announcements. This talk will be recorded. It will be made available to people in the NTU community that were not able to attend today, and will be available just for a short time, but you should be aware that this is being recorded. During the talk, please keep your microphones muted and your video off, but then feel free to bring it back on when we open it up for questions later. For students that would like to get their attendance checked for seminar attendance, please just, rename your display name using your email address, and then we will have a record of that there. And then finally, like I said, we'll come back to an open format Q&A at the end. You can drop messages in the chat throughout the talk as they arise for you, and you can also talk yourself later on. So before I get started, I want to just take a couple of moments to share with you a little bit more about this initiative called Powers that is co-sponsoring this series. Powers is an abbreviation for the Promotion of Women in Engineering, Research, and Science. It's a new program here at NTU that's driven by women at NTU, and it's supported by the Ministry of Education. And its aim is to encourage and empower women to pursue and stay in STEM education and careers, with the goal to increase gender diversity in STEM fields. And so moving on to our main event, I'm really pleased to have with us our guest speaker, Professor Cordelia Fine. And she's going to talk about who wants greater workplace gender equality. And I'll just say a few words of introduction about Cordelia. So she was educated in the UK. She got her bachelor's degree at Oxford University, master's at Cambridge, and her PhD in psychology at University College London. After that, I think she moved directly to Australia. And during that time, from 2012 to 2016, she was an ARC Future Fellow, so very prestigious. And then during that time, she rose through the academic ranks. And she now holds the title of full professor in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. Her academic research pursuits are broad, and she's quite prolific. And I think we'll be hearing about some of that work here today, so I won't take any more time about that. In addition to her academic research, she's also a really prolific writer in more popular realms. She's published a couple of award-winning books, Delusions of Gender, and most recently, Testosterone Rex, and this won the Royal Society Science Book Prize in the year it was published. She also most recently won in 2018 the Edinburgh Medal, which is a very prestigious award that recognizes scientists who have excelled in their field and contributed significantly to our understanding of humanity. And notably, this previous award winners include Sir David Attenborough and Professor Jane Goodall. So they are in very good company with Professor Fine. And this award was also based in part for her work in challenging gender bias in science and for her contributions to public debates about gender equality. She also writes regularly for a number of other popular media outlets that we all know: New York Times, Financial Times, Guardian, Scientific American, Wall Street Journal. So you can read her work all over the place. And so with that, I will stop and hand the floor over to Cordelia.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's not as great a pleasure as to be in Singapore in person, but it's a great pleasure nonetheless to be part of this seminar series. So thank you so much for the invitation. So let me now share my screen and I will begin. All right. So I just want to start by acknowledging my collaborators, sort of pick and choose from them on the various projects that I'll be talking about today. But here they are in all their glory, all my wonderful collaborators. But I want to officially start my talk by sharing with you some claims from this recent book published just a few years ago by Palgrave Macmillan. And I've chosen this book because it's a very typical example of what seems to be a currently dominant approach to the topic of gender equality in the workplace. So like many other books, articles, and in fact, diversity consultants, the authors make two main claims. The first is that men and women are fundamentally different and that these differences are deeply rooted in evolved biology. So they say the way men and women see their worlds is fundamentally different, and that difference comes from their basic reproductive biology. In particular, they argue that men are competitive, status-seeking, and focused on solving problems, while women, they argue, in contrast, are far less concerned with their place in the social hierarchy and are collaborative and empathic. Now, the author's second claim is that the inclusion of women in the workplace matters because it enables organizations to leverage women's uniquely feminine skills and capacities in order to gain competitive advantage through enhanced performance. So to quote from them again, the power of gender difference, not gender equality, is a secret source for success. Properly valuing brain gender diversity in the workplace is one of the biggest and largely untapped sources of competitive advantage for modern businesses. Recent advances in neuroscience provide the key to unlocking it. Now, in my talk today, I want to draw attention to three problems with this approach, which I'm going to refer to as the essentialist business case. Now, the first problem is that the assumptions or the assertions that are made about differences between women and men are contradicted by science regarding the science and pattern of those differences between women and men. The second problem is that there's a growing body of evidence that this kind of men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or gender essentialist way of thinking about the sex differences is actually associated with behaviors and attitudes that are supportive of maintaining the gender status quo, not changing it. And third, if we talk exclusively in terms of business case arguments, and certainly once we take away the very gender stereotypical claims that are being made, there are sort of good arguments to be made from a business case perspective, but if we only focus on those, we're going to crowd out important justice-based arguments, perhaps not even become aware of them. So let me begin with the tension between this essentialist business case and the evidence regarding sex differences in behavior. Now, the idea that women and men have fundamentally different natures that suit them to different roles and positions in society is, of course, a very old idea. I mean, for all the talk about new neuroscientific evidence, the kind of conclusion that's being drawn is a very old one. And in fact, not so very long ago, it was this very assumption that was the basis for justifications for restricting opportunities for women in public life, particularly when they became married or had children. For example, in an Australian parliamentary debate about the introduction of federal sex discrimination legislation in Australia, which occurred in 1984, one MP complained that the philosophy from which this bill springs does not recognise any innate differences between male and female. The sexes are not in competition, he said, but according to the rules of nature, complement each other. Now, we've got the very same idea here, right? So we're still talking about men and women being complementary to each other, but this same complementarity that not so very long ago, within my lifetime, was being used as grounds for exclusion is now the basis for arguments for inclusion. So the idea is that women have these valuable complementary skills and perspectives, but they're actually valuable in the workplace as well as in the domestic sphere. Now, the point that stereotypically feminine qualities may be undervalued or marginalized in the workplace is an important one, and it's one that I agree with. So, for example, for a number of years, I taught judgment and decision-making in a business school, and one of the first biases that my colleagues and I would teach to the MBA students was the overconfidence bias, because overconfidence is so often a source of delays, disruption, and even failure in organizations. And yet, despite this, you will often find organizations sending women to workshops to increase their self-confidence, as opposed to sending men to workshops to increase their humility. So that's a kind of sign of the fact that what's stereotypically masculine is sort of overvalued, and what's seen as stereotypically feminine is undervalued. But what is being proposed by the essentialist business case goes further to this. So it's saying not just that feminine qualities are undervalued, but that for reasons for evolved biology, men tend to only hold the masculine traits and not feminine ones, and women tend to hold feminine traits and not masculine ones. Now, over the last 10 years ago, I've carefully examined both the scientific and popular claims about sex differences in brain and behavior. So in Delusions of Gender, I challenged claims that prenatal testosterone and hardwired sex differences in the brain make males on average biologically predisposed to try to understand the world, and females on average biologically predisposed to care for others, and that these differences help to explain the horizontal sex segregation that we see in society, the fact that women tend to cluster into some industries and men into others. Then into Testosterone Rex, I unraveled claims that sex differences in evolved biology inevitably make men more competitive and risk-taking than men, and that it's these kinds of differences that explain vertical segregation, the fact that whichever industry you look at, regardless of how many women you have at entry level, by the time you reach the top of the organization, you're mostly seeing men rather than women. Now, obviously, in this talk, I can't go into the details of these debates about the biological contributions to sex differences in brain behavior and gender segregated workplaces. But in fact, for the purposes of this talk, we can actually set aside these debates and simply focus on the somewhat less contested issue of what the psychological differences between women and men actually are, setting aside the question of what their origins are. So I want to begin by briefly talking about the magnitude of sex differences in behavior, which are often grossly exaggerated by popular writers, and then turn to an issue that has until recently been fairly neglected, which is how these masculine and feminine characteristics combine in individuals. And then amongst this, I'll also touch on difference that's sometimes put forward to suggest that sex segregation of occupations, and often STEM, in fact, is inevitable, which is sex differences in interest versus sex differences in interest in things versus people. So let me begin with the size of differences. Now, popular writers, and occasionally often sometimes scientists, sometimes talk about average sex differences as if they mean that men are mostly like this, while women are mostly like that. For example, this popular book, Results at the Top, Using Gender Intelligence to Create Breakthrough Growth, which is targeted at business leaders, describes the difference in average tendencies and how men and women think as huge, with only 20% overlap in the tendency to think factually versus intuitively, as you can see in this figure here. Note, they also attribute these differences to hardwired differences in brains and hormones. Now, I don't know where the authors got these data from, maybe the Journal of Nonsense, and let me explain why I'm skeptical. In 2005, in what is now quite a famous study, the psychologist Janet Hyde synthesized dozens and dozens of statistical reviews or meta-analyses of decades of sex differences research. And this found that 30% of differences in the literature were what we would call very small. If you're a psychologist and you know about, or other behavioral scientists and you know about effect sizes, this is what this looks like here, a very small average difference. A further 48% were small and another 15% were medium. Now, there were some large differences, and in case you're wondering what the largest differences were, these were frequency of masturbation, attitudes towards casual sex, and throwing distance and throwing velocity. And I think we can agree that in most organizations, these kinds of behaviors are not key to success or productivity. And in fact, even of these, only the sex differences in throwing capacities were actually in the same range as this graph here. So when we're talking about social and cognitive differences, the kinds of differences that we tend to use in particularly non-manual workplaces, these are quite modest differences. So in other words, Hyde found that for more than 3/4 of these kinds of sex differences, they're so small that if you chose a woman and a man at random, the woman's score would be more masculine than the man's, or the man's score would be more feminine than the woman's, at least 40% of the time. And just to make this sort of abstract idea a bit more concrete, this is the case for sex differences in leadership style, in favoring ethical business practices, in masculine values such as interest in social status, prestige, control, and dominance, and personal success, and in more feminine caring values. Now, if we return back to this figure, there's also something else rather important about it. So you can notice here that we've got, our masculine trait of being a factual thinker here, and our intuitive trait of being our feminine trait of being intuitive here. And you notice that they're kind of assumed to be polar opposites of each other. So you can be a factual thinker if you're at the extreme male pole, you can be an intuitive thinker if you're at the extreme female pole, or you can be kind of mediocre at both if you're somewhere in the middle. But implicitly, the assumption here is that the more masculine your way of thinking is, the less feminine it is, and vice versa. So you couldn't be a really good factual and intuitive thinker. And in fact, it's really interesting. There have been some very interesting interview studies with Nobel Prize winning scientists who actually found that intuitive thinking is actually quite a key component of their scientific reasoning and innovation. Here's the same assumption at work in the book I started with, All the Brains in the Business. The authors argue that men and women's brains have very different operating modes. So supposedly there's a problem-solving male brain and a collaborative female brain. So even setting aside the gender stereotypes here, is it really the case that men can't collaborate and that women can't solve problems? There's an implicit polarity here. The assumption is that one's brain is either designed to solve problems or it's designed, its operating design is to collaborate. But, why on earth couldn't somebody be good at both? Not least the possibility of collaborating in order to solve problems. So gender scholars have often noted that as soon as we start thinking about traits that are imbued with sort of gendered assumptions, we start to think in these polarized men are from Mars, women are from Venus ways. But actually masculinity and femininity are not like this. And we can translate this discussion into attributes for which we actually have data, which come from something called the empathizing systemizing theory of sex differences. Empathizing here refers to the tendency to be attuned to the thoughts or feelings of others and to respond sympathetically to them, which we can already see as a kind of stereotypically feminine trait, whereas systemizing refers to an interest in an ability to understand systems. So they might be mechanical systems, electrical systems, scientific systems, economic systems, social systems. The idea is that you're interested in working out the input, rule, output function. Or to put it all more concisely, empathizers are interested in people and systemizers are interested in things. Now, interestingly, this theory, which was developed by Cambridge University psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen, implicitly makes the same assumption as the popular authors that I've just talked about. The idea that empathizing and systemizing represent polar ends of a single continuum. In other words, the more your brain is honed for systemizing, the less good it will be at empathizing and vice versa. Thus, Baron-Cohen suggests that people with autism have an extreme male brain, which means that they're very good at systemizing and very poor at empathizing, according to the theory. Now, several years ago, a colleague of mine, I won't name him, but a very talented philosopher, took the empathizing and systemizing test. So these are sort of self-report surveys, which are supposed to diagnose what kind of brain you have. Do you have a female empathizing brain or a male systemizing brain? And after he took the tests, he reported to me that since he scored low on both, apparently he had no brain at all. A bit more technically, his results on the test reflect the fact that there's actually only a very weak relationship between self-reported empathizing and self-reported systemizing. In other words, a high empathizing score can go alongside a high systemizing score. You might hit the jackpot and be good at both. Or as my colleague discovered, you can score low on both or any of one of those combinations. In other words, instead of neatly lining up on a single continuum, people can be scattered around these four quadrants of the two dimensions. And I haven't used pink and blue here because once again, the effect sizes in terms of sex differences in these self-reported abilities are in that kind of size of range that we've already seen. Now, this turns out to be an important feature of sex differences in cognitive and social traits. So while it's true that women on average have more feminine traits than men, and men have more masculine traits than women, within a single individual, the vast majority of people will have a mix of traits that are more common in men and some traits that are more common in women. And what that means is that these differences that we see at the population level in an individual tend to mix up rather than add up. And as a result of this, if you have enough behavioral traits, if you know enough about a person's behavior, and these traits vary by sex, then you can predict with good accuracy whether someone is male or female, but you can't do the opposite. That is, you can't predict what someone is like on the basis of their sex. So if I say to you, there's somebody under my table, he's male, tell me what he's like, you have no idea what that person is like. And of course, it's a person's particular combination of attributes that tell you what they're like and how different or similar they are to someone else. So when advocates for the essentialist business case argue that we need more women on boards or on this team because women are X, Y, and Z, they're making generalizations, what an individual is like because they're male or female, and they're making generalizations about what males are like and what females like that this data may support at the level of the population, but don't support at the individual level. Now, as a caveat to these statements, it certainly could be the case that sometimes average sex differences do sometimes contribute to occupational inequalities. But, as a caveat to that, first of all, average sex differences aren't fixed. So we know from much data that they vary across time and place. We also know that most roles allow for a variety of combinations of attributes to be successful. So it's not like every successful biologist is the same and every successful investment banker is the same. And it's probably better that we have, a bunch of biologists and a bunch of investment bankers who do have heterogeneity. A third point is that we rarely know exactly what merit does or can look like. So our ideas of merit may be shaped by the sort of incumbents of the role. And, this brings us to the final point that we tend to assume that what is more common in men is what you need for male-dominated jobs and and vice versa. So what's more common in females tends to be what you need to be good at female-dominated jobs. And in fact, there are some really fascinating sociology case studies that show this phenomenon. So these were studies that were charting which jobs became female dominated, sort of following the second wave feminist movement in the US. And one example of this was publishing, which had been a very male dominated industry and then gradually became female dominated through the authors argued a sort of series of economic circumstances and due to changes in the industry, including it becoming a less desirable job. But what happened was that as women became more prominent in that industry, the kind of notion of what it took to become a good publisher changed. So this idea that the publisher had to be very empathic to their neurotic writers, for example, became part of what it took to be a good publisher, these sort of stereotypically feminine skills. Okay, so this dominant narrative about workplace gender equality is in tension with the science of sex differences. But we could say, well, look, maybe from a pragmatic or a political point of view, that doesn't matter. So as long as, as long as we arguing that women have these unique complementary traits motivates action, then maybe we should just go with it anyway. Well, now the first obvious response to this is that anyone who cares about evidence-based policy should not be particularly comfortable with this kind of ends justifies the means approach. But in addition, it's not clear that this means will help us to reach this end. This is because a growing literature suggests that even pragmatically or politically speaking, the essentialist component of the business case may well actually backfire. So several studies have now found that both endorsement of gender essentialist views, so the tendency to think of men and these men are from Mars, women are from Venus ways, and or exposure to these kinds of accounts are associated with things like greater endorsement of gender stereotypes, more stereotypical self-perception, increased tolerance for the status quo and sex discrimination, greater gender system justification, so saying that current arrangements between women and men are fair, preference for traditional roles, greater preference for a male primary breadwinner, preference for work-family trade-offs that reinforce the gender wage gap, and among parents, stronger endorsement of gender norms regarding appropriate jobs and activities for boys and girls. And so with my colleagues, Leah Skews and Nick Haslam, we wanted to look at this more closely, in particular this link between gender essentialist thinking and kind of commonly identified attitudes, organizational judgments in the workplace. So in this study, we developed a new gender essentialism scale, and we trialled it in large nationally representative samples of about 1,800 people in Australia and Denmark. Now, in both countries, gender essentialists were, we found, less in favour of egalitarian roles in relationships, parenting, work, and education. We found that they were more supportive of discriminatory work practices. We found that they're more likely to perceive contemporary workplaces as non-discriminatory. And in both countries, these associations were independent of political orientation and general acceptance of social hierarchy. In other words, we found that gender essentialists don't oppose gender equality simply because they're conservative or generically anti-egalitarian. And we also investigated whether gender essentialists would react negatively towards women and men who don't conform to gender norms, which is the so-called backlash effect. So in particular, we predicted that people who see gender categories as natural and deep-seated would be especially critical of those who violate gendered expectations. And this is what we found doing vignettes of male or female politicians who either did or didn't display power-seeking ambitions. So although the effects were modest, gender essentialists were more likely than non-essentialists to express moral outrage about a female political candidate who was described as power-seeking and by a male candidate who was not. Now, in recent work with Victor Soho, Morgan Weaving, and Holly Lawford-Smith, we looked in more detail about the relations between gender essentialism on the one hand and attitudes towards efforts to increase gender equality in the workplace on the other hand. So we surveyed just over 1,000 Australian workers from a wide range of industries, roughly gender balanced with a mean age of 45. And what we did is we asked them a range of questions about the benefits and downsides about efforts to increase gender balance in organisations. And we asked these questions separately in reference both to efforts to increase gender balance in leadership, so vertical gender balance, and also to increase gender balance across industries, so horizontal gender balance. Now, as I'll come back to later, for both the benefits and the downsides, some of our questions related to justice-based reasons, so things like increasing gender balance in leadership will lead to greater gender equality in power and leadership, or these efforts to increase gender balance are just political correctness and virtue signaling that achieve nothing. And some of our benefits and downsides questions related to business case reasons. So greater gender balance would have a positive effect on the quality of board decision making, or these efforts will have a negative effect on team performance. Now, in fact, our factor analysis of the data showed that all endorsements of all kinds of benefits were all highly intercorrelated, so they just all clustered together in one clump, as was endorsement of all downsides. So in the analyses I'm going to show you, we're just looking at single benefits and downsides variables. We also asked them about their support for a range of affirmative action initiatives. So these vary from relatively weak forms, like simply encouraging women to apply for positions, to some of the stronger forms, like establishing targets for female representation. And then finally, we also measured gender essentialism using the scale validated with the Danish and Australian samples. And our primary question of interest here was, what is the relationship between gender essentialist beliefs and these other variables? And what we found, as you can see here, is a significant association between gender essentialism and both perceived benefits and perceived downsides. So greater gender essentialism was associated with seeing perceived benefits as being less convincing, and greater gender essentialism was associated with perceived downsides as being more convincing. So the more gender essentialist you are, the more worried you are that there'll be some kind of downsides from trying to create a greater gender equality. And these effects all survived controlling for gender, income, age, and workplace status. Similarly, we found regression analyses demonstrated a significant association between gender essentialism and affirmative action, where greater gender essentialism is associated with less support for affirmative action. And again, this effect remains the same when controlling for all those other variables. Now, obviously, correlation doesn't imply causation. And in addition, if we go back and look at these scatter plots, I think there's something kind of interesting going on here, though I haven't quantified it, which is that there clearly are some individuals who hold gender essentialist beliefs while also being persuaded of the benefits of gender balance, or at the same time not being convinced by the downside. So interestingly, we don't see the opposite. So we don't see non-gender essentialists who don't see any benefits and see lots of downsides. So, you know, there's certainly variability here. But overall, this adds to a growing literature indicating that in general, gender essentialist beliefs tend to be associated with support for the gender status quo, including in a workplace setting. Okay, so the essentialist business case approach is contradicted by the size and pattern of sex differences. It promotes gender essentialist beliefs that are associated with preferences and attitudes that tend to support gender roles and norms, and a lack of support for efforts to change gender balance within organizations. The final issue that I want to discuss is that business case, and I should say this includes business case arguments that don't draw on these essentialist claims, and there are some such arguments, that when we focus simply on business case arguments, we're kind of sidelining matters of justice. And in fact, this is often seen as a strength of this particular approach, that it sort of sweeps aside equality or justice concerns. So for example, in a book called 7 Steps to Leading a Gender Balanced Business, published by the prestigious Harvard Business Review Press, the leading gender consultant Aviva Wittenberg-Cox designates an end goal of equality as an outdated 20th century framework. And she says that in this framework, the end goal is competitive advantage. In All the Brains in the Business, the book we've already looked at, the authors describe the argument for equality as a loser's catch-up game. And the authors instead recommend gaining organizational advantage from the emergent quality of women. Now, anecdotally, I go to many gender equality conferences and events, and I found that many people there, including people who very clearly care very deeply about issues of fairness and justice, take it for granted that framing their advocacy for promoting women in terms of benefits to the bottom line is the only way to make things happen, even in not-for-profit organizations like universities. And in line with this, based on our interviews with human resources practitioners, the management academic Aug2021 concluded that diversity was no longer treated as a principle by HR advocates, but as a product to be marketed and sold to different stakeholders in the company. And as an example of this, in a relatively recent panel event as part of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, I was interested to hear Vivian Arts, who at the time was speaking as the president and CEO of Women in Banking and Finance in September 2020, say in a panel discussion about something called the Women in Finance Charter in the UK. She said that one of the things I found is that there's very little traction in talking about equality, but there is an awful lot of traction in talking about the business case. And if you can't win their hearts, you can certainly win their minds when you start to discuss the business case. In fact, as it happened, this was a panel discussing the sort of 4 years of progress from the women in, sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, my dog's making a funny groaning noise, you probably can't hear it, I apologize if you can. This was a panel event about this Women in Finance Charter, and in fact, over the 4 years, they'd seen very minimal progress in the number of women in management in finance, so it seems that even if it was winning minds, it wasn't gaining much traction. So what is the problem here? Well, the problem when discussion focuses exclusively on the instrumental benefits for organizations of including women, when the question is, what can women do for organizations as opposed to what should organizations be doing for women, we of course pay less attention to why creating genuinely equal opportunities is important as a matter of justice to individual women, for the status of women as a group in society, and the idea that organizations have an obligation to play their role in the complex social problem of reducing the material, social, and political disadvantages faced by any marginalized group, including but beyond women. So as my colleagues Victor Soho and Holly Lawford-Smith and I have recently summarized, and if you're interested in reading this paper, I'd be very happy to send you a PDF. Feel free to email me. There are some quite neglected justice-based reasons to try to increase gender balance in organizations. So these include, for example, that workplace sex discrimination is a barrier to women's equal access to the many goods of paid work, and it therefore contributes to the political, socio-cultural, and material disadvantages that women face. That both theory and data give us reason to think that equality begets more equality. So the data are kind of suggestive that greater gender balance in organizations may actually help to reduce both direct and indirect forms of sex discrimination, as well as sex-based harassment. And third, that greater gender balance may help to reduce an androcentric bias in important products and services, whereby male attributes, experiences, perspectives, interests, and concerns are taken as the norm, and female perspectives and interests are marginalized. So as the legal scholar Julie Suk has put it, when you have a demographically homogenous leadership, this can result in a distortion of the institutions necessary to sustain a legitimate, well-functioning democracy. These include the governance of organs of the state, but also include schools and universities and the economic institutions that exert enough power to govern, in effect, social life and human civilization. Now, since this is a university audience with a sort of specific aim in mind for the seminar series, I want to give you an example of what appears to be a manifestation of this androcentric bias within a male-dominated academic discipline. And this is based on research with colleagues Karsten Morawski and Nitin Yadav from the Department of Finance at the University of Melbourne. Now, what we did is we performed an analysis of more than 125,000 academic finance articles published between 1918 and 1922. And as you can see in these graphs here, we found that the literature is heavily dominated by male authors, and in fact, particularly authors from the US. So you can see that 70.1% of the articles were male dominated, with many fewer, much lower percentages for even moderate numbers of males, mixed, female moderate, or female dominated. And this just shows you that although there has been improvements over time, even at the end of our timeline in terms of collecting articles in 2020, there was still very low representation of women. Now, despite the fact that across the globe there is female disadvantage in finance-related laws, leadership of financial institutions, and disadvantage in financial outcomes, we found that, sorry, that was World War II. We found that when we looked at 55 or 1,000 or so articles in our corpus for which abstracts are available, we were interested in seeing how many of them actually attended to issues of sex and gender. And we found that, in fact, only 0.78% of the corpus investigated sex, gender questions. And so this is actually just a visual representation of the entire corpus for which we had abstracts, so sort of divided into the sorts of topics that are included, and the in bold, the squares in bold just give you a sense of how few articles are actually investigating these questions. We also found that of those studies that did look at questions of sex and gender, the majority of these were actually concerned with the instrumental benefits of women for others, such as institutions. So, for example, ironically enough, a common example was research testing the business case for gender diversity. So looking at the question of, do banks make more money when they have more women on boards? Now, consistent with the idea that women's low representation in academic finance contributes to this lack of attention to research that studies, and in particular could benefit women, we found that female authors were overrepresented among studies investigating questions of sex and gender, and especially among the few studies, 0.13%, that investigated gender barriers to women's financial outcomes and well-being. Now, the point here is that if we simply focus on business case arguments for female representation in academic finance, something like, increasing the talent pool, or maybe we'll increase our market of students, we miss something really important, which is the matter that universities are supposed to serve the entire community in the knowledge that they produce. And if you have a very heavily male-dominated cohort of knowledge producers, the research that is being produced is not equitable in the benefits that are brought to the larger community. Now, in other work, we found that actually, perhaps to a surprising degree, employees in general care about these justice issues. So this is data that I've been collecting with Morgan Weaving, Victor Soho, and Holly Lawford-Smith. And what we did is that we began by recruiting a sample of 241 Australian workers. So our sample was gender balanced, predominantly Caucasian, and nationally representative in terms of the gender balance of the industry that we're in. So we had about 60% of our cohort in gender balanced industries and about 20% each in female dominated versus male dominated industries. And what we did is we showed our sample these graphs displaying the current state of gender segregation in Australian workplaces, both the vertical segregation we see with 17.1% of women at the highest levels of organizations, and also horizontal segregation. And then we asked some open-ended questions about the potential reasons, benefits, and downsides of attempting to increase gender balance. And so we asked them both about gender balance across industries and occupations, so horizontal gender balance, and also in leadership positions, so vertical balance. And in each case, we said, if you think there are no good reasons or benefits or downsides, you can say so. So we gave them the opportunity to say, I do not think there will be any benefits from trying to create more women in leadership, or whatever it might be. And I should say some of our participants did avail themselves of this opportunity. So by asking participants about vertical and horizontal segregation separately, and benefits and downsides from both efforts to create greater gender balance and the achievement of greater gender balance, we wanted to make sure we created a broad set of participant-generated responses from each participant and from the sample overall. And what we're really trying to achieve here is, rather than thinking what's in our heads about why gender equality in the workplace matters, and then asking our participants to what extent they agreed with us, we wanted to find out, what do people working in organizations in Australia think about this? What are their spontaneous answers to these questions? Then what we did was we looked at these open-ended responses. We produced a taxonomy of themes, and then we coded all the responses by hand. Now, our coding frame had 27 minor themes, and the majority of these fell into two major themes, whether they concerned justice-related benefits or these kind of business case or organizational benefits. We double-coded 30% of our sample. We did have somewhat low inter-rater reliability for some of our minor themes, but they were adequate for our major themes, which is what I'm going to focus on. So the data I'm going to talk about draw on binary code variables. For each of the 27 themes, did the participant mention it, yes or no, at some point across the relevant questions? So what we identified 6 distinct justice-related pro-gender balance themes, and I've listed them here in order of frequency from most to least. Remember, these are being spontaneously generated by our participants. We haven't put any ideas into their heads. So these are issues of representation. For example, an equal voice for all members of society, all consumers, clients. Justice and fairness. Reduces bias and disadvantage. Challenges gender norms. Will furnish equal dignity, respect, and worth to women. Responds to social norms. This is just what we expect. We also identified 2 justice-related downsides, which were undermines merit, and this is just political correctness or virtue signaling. And we identified 5 organizational benefits. So, it brings different attributes, business benefits, better workplaces, larger talent pool, and it brings consumer benefits. We also identified a few organizational downsides, so that these efforts will cause psychological or interpersonal damage, and it will harm organizational functioning in some ways. So what were our main findings? Well, what we found is that people, I think this is the most important finding really, is that people care about justice. So spontaneously, 86% of our participants cited a justice-related benefit compared to 66% instrumental benefits. We did also find, though, that a substantial minority are concerned in particular that these kinds of initiatives will undermine merit and that will cause psychological or interpersonal effects that are damaging. We also found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that women are generally more positive about efforts to increase gender balance, and they're less skeptical about them. So, for example, they are less likely to say there are no benefits to these kinds of efforts. Now, this is a relatively small exploratory sample, so these are tentative findings, but we did get similar results with the quantitative study that I mentioned earlier. And in particular, we found that justice benefits were endorsed at least as much as organizational benefits. In case you're interested, this is these are the extent to which our participants found different arguments about the benefits of vertical and horizontal equality convincing on a 1 to 9 scale, where 9 is very convincing and 1 is not at all convincing. So you can see that on average, people are sort of fairly convinced by these kinds of arguments. So what are the implications for advocates or policymakers? Well, I think the first implication is to watch out for essentialist framings. So framing gender diversity initiatives in terms, or efforts in terms of leveraging women's different and complementary thinking styles is likely to be not just inaccurate, but also unproductive. So our findings point to the need for care and accuracy in how arguments for promoting greater gender equality are made. Now, although our study can't disentangle cause and effect, and as I mentioned, some people who endorse gender essentialist beliefs are also supportive of change, the overall pattern is that gender essentialism is associated with negative views towards the wisdom of efforts to change the gender status quo. Arguing that women are fundamentally different to men isn't just inaccurate, it could also increase skepticism about the wisdom of such efforts. If we're so different, why would we expect us to have similar kinds of jobs? Now, this doesn't mean that we have to treat women and men as interchangeable. So we can discuss the benefits of including previously excluded perspectives and experiences without attributing those different standpoints to a kind of timeless, universal womanly essence. We can recognize that gender balance can change group dynamics by altering group norms, not by a simplistic, just add a woman model. And we don't have to fall back on gender essentialism to argue that institutions or industries or academic fields of research that are primarily led by a homogenous group of people will tend to neglect the interests, concerns, and needs of other groups. A second implication is that in designing or implementing or promoting a particular workplace gender or diversity initiative, it's important to anticipate and respond to concerns about undermining merit and detrimental psychological or interpersonal effects. So in our quantitative study, the 2 negative statements with which participants found the most convincing were that efforts would lead to a situation in which the best person for the job is less likely to be chosen and places undue emphasis on gender issues and excludes or ignores other marginalized groups. So careful design and promotion of affirmative action measures can be helpful here, as well as a commitment to monitoring and review. And the last point, but perhaps not the least point, is that don't give up on justice arguments. So while the organizational benefits of workplace gender diversity are important, relying on them alone implicitly makes women's inclusion contingent on evidence that women add value. The question is what women can do for organizations rather than what organizations need to do for women. Now, when the empirical evidence for that value add is shaky, as it can be, this is a risky strategy. And it also makes efforts to increase gender balance seem discretionary becomes just one of many things that an organization could consider doing in order to improve its performance, rather than something that's actually just legally and ethically obligatory. And finally, focusing solely on organizational benefits may overlook a powerful and potentially widespread motivation, justice and fairness. So, as a relatively small sample of 1,000 people or so, but our research does indicate that on the whole, many Australian employees do care about gender justice for a broad range of reasons, including reasons that rarely are discussed. In other words, there may be more receptive grounds for justice arguments than we think. Socially important and powerful institutions, including science, lack democratic legitimacy to the extent that certain groups are excluded. They also share in collective responsibility for solving complex social problems like gender inequality. And the good news is that many everyday employees seem sympathetic to these ideas. I'll finish there. Thank you very much. And very much look forward to, your questions. Thank you.
There I am. Thank you so much, Cordelia. That was really interesting. Also, at times, wryly funny. And I think that's one of the disadvantages of you not seeing all of us is you can't see us chuckling at your jokes in our living room. But thank you for that. So what we'll do now is we'll open this up for questions. So please either type them in the chat or you can raise your hand. I'm looking at the participant list, so I'll see you as you raise your hand and I will call on you. But I guess maybe I'll just start to get the room warmed up a little bit. I think this justice approach is really interesting. I think your data are really interesting. So I had a couple of questions about the data set. So maybe the sample size was too small. Were you able to look sort of throughout the organization whether those perceptions or that the view that this justice approach is meaningful to people? You said you see it in the workers. Do you also see it equally in the management? And I'm guessing not, because you see some gender skewing of this, and that probably changes vertically, right?
Yes, sure, exactly. So one thing is probably important to say that we weren't sampling sort of particular organizations targeted from different industries. So we used Qualtrics, who approach people who, so that overall the sample met our criteria. So they weren't all from the same. They weren't all from the same organization. So yes, our qualitative study wasn't ideally set up to, look, sort of disaggregate by organizational level, but we did oversample managers, and we did tend to find that they were a little bit less positive about these measures than others. And there is a sense to the extent that the higher up you get, the more motivation there is to think that you're in a meritocracy, right? And everyone sort of earned where they are. But I think one issue here is that manager is an extremely broad category that can include, managing one person to managing three, however many people. So it probably, even if were we to look at those data, would probably include quite a heterogeneous group. And, we also have to allow for the fact that there are certain people with positions who are probably not likely to be filling in form, doing research in Qualtrics. So, really probably the next stage would be to collaborate with an industry and, be sort of directly targeting in a partnership a sort of particular organization or organizations within a particular industry, so that we could look at that a bit better. But one of my former colleagues at the Melbourne Business School, Isabel Metz, has done many interview studies with a cohort who are known as the Male Champions of Change in Australia. So they actually have a few women now who have a different title, but these are sort of mostly male CEOs who kind of get together to try and increase gender equality. And she interviewed them about their motivations for doing this. And it was interesting because, particularly the ones who were the kind of leaders in this, as opposed to the ones who kind of saw that it was taking off and wanted to join the club, they often cited justice reasons, and often to do with, seeing their female partners or their daughters sort of struggling, or having, just witnessed these kinds of injustices and having driven to want to change their organizations or industries to be more equal. So that was kind of interesting that although there's a lot of talk about the business case narrative, it seems that even these people who actually have a lot to gain from more profitable businesses in a way that someone working on the shop floor might not care about so much. Even here, that's among the leaders, the justice seemed to be a primary motivation. One could be cynical and say that they want to come across as caring, but it's not clear to me that that's the case. There's almost something. I mean, particularly when you're in a profit-driven organization, you have a duty to shareholders. I actually think it's not very easy to say that you're doing something because you think it's the right thing to do. In a way, it seems more legitimate to say that you're doing it because you think it will be more profitable.
Thank you for that. So then maybe just as a follow-up question, so how do we use that lesson and sort of, so, maybe those leaders, they have a different view, and we know that the workforce from at least your early data sort of have similar views. How do we use that, or can we use that to maybe influence, management or folks that aren't thinking this way to maybe shift the conversation at least?
Yes, I wish I had a good answer to that question. I mean, I suspect that a kind of combination of strategies is probably beneficial. And I think one thing to probably sort of try, people who study trying to change ethically charged behavior kind of have certain kinds of tips. So, one tip is like, don't berate people for their past performance. Don't make them feel bad about the fact that they've run an organization that's sort of discriminatory, because they'll just, they'll become defensive and kind of rationalize what's been going on, but sort of, be future focused. If we were to achieve this, then, imagine, X, Y, Z. I guess combining things like, think of all the talent that we're losing in combination with the only way that we can create an equal playing field is to sort of shift the balance within the organization. I think probably combinations of things may be beneficial, but it also might I guess it's also probably quite hard to answer that question in the abstract. I used to teach ethical leadership, and there was a fantastic program that I ran called Giving Voice to Values. And what that did is it talks you through very strategically how to try and promote positive change in your organization. Now, the focus tended to be when there was something sort of grossly unethical going on, sort of, I don't know, selling junk insurance or something like this, right? But it has a very structured way of saying, what's the action that you want to have promoted? What are the rationalizations objections that are going to come back at you? Thinking, what's the evidence? What are my most persuasive counter arguments that I can make against those objections? What evidence can I bring that will be persuasive? Who can I bring on board? Who's going to be an ally? How do I discuss this? When do I discuss this? So it's a way of thinking very strategically about how to address a sort of specific issue, evidence, data, allies, approach. So, that can be something that if there's something in particular that you sort of thinking about wanting to promote, sort of thinking about that. And I think the key aspect of it is, people are actually amazingly good at predicting what the objections are going to be, right? So you say, we need to do this. Like, you already know what the objections are going to be. So it's not rocket science, but it's just anticipating them and arming yourself, right?
Right. Okay, so speaking of objections, we have a question in the chat from Rafaela and Nathan. And so she says, thank you so much for the enriching talk. In addition to business case arguments, how can we move past the concerns about diminishing merit? And then also, what should we think? What should we think of responses that were not gender essentialist, but some more potential downsides in gender balance?
Okay, thanks for those questions, Rafaela. So I'm going to, in a sense, actually, I think my answers to both of these questions are a little bit interrelated. So I was kind of interested, looking at the scatter points of the relationships between gender essentialism and in particular with affirmative action. Now, as I said, I haven't quantified this, but it was a much weaker relationship between this gender essentialist thinking and affirmative action. And to me, this speaks to the idea that people may have objections to affirmative action, not because they disagree with the ends. They might be all for creating greater gender balance or be worried about unequal opportunities in a particular work setting, but they don't think that a particular affirmative action approach is a way of the right way of going about it. So I think that's important to remember. I don't know how things are in Singapore, but sometimes these debates can get quite polarized. Now, how do you respond to those kinds of concerns? Well, again, that's it's a little bit difficult to answer in the abstract, but some examples would be encouraging a kind of broader thinking about what merit actually looks like, considering the fact that when you recruit somebody or bring someone onto a team or a project, you can't just consider them as an individual, but think about how they what they contribute to the group as a whole. So if you already have 7 engineers on a team, you might get more value from someone who isn't an engineer joining that team. And then also thinking, if you're thinking in this sort of broader way about what do we need to be a legitimate institution, of course, there are going to be settings where this is a more relevant argument than others. Then you can't just think of the person as an individual. You actually have to think about, when this person joins this group, what's that group going to look like as a whole? Challenging preconceptions about what merit actually means. Like, we do tend to assume that merit looks just like the people who currently hold the position, and we may not necessarily have particularly good evidence for that. Committing to monitoring and reviewing. So let's see how these people will commit to monitoring this initiative and ensuring that we do maintain quality, and if we don't, then ensuring that there is a sort of data-driven approach behind it, for instance. So I hope that's, and I think, like, we were having a conversation before about the statistics in Singapore, and I think just like being able to look to other countries and saying, look, we have so few women compared to country X, in this fantastic university, like, surely we're missing out on what, why on earth would we think that we were undermining merit? One almost says, if you're excluding a particular group, then you should be equally worried about undermining merit, right? So these are all very woolly answers, but as I say, it's a little bit difficult to answer that question in the abstract.
Okay. Thanks for that. It looks like we have a question from Sugning. Do you want to? There you go.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I really like the emphasis on justice, and that question about what does merit mean. I've got one comment and one question, which I think you would probably hear very often. So the one comment is, I can't help but to be cynical that people really care about justice. And what I feel is like people would say they care about justice until it's personally costly, until it means that they may not get their job, or, until it means that somebody else will be promoted. And that's when the real struggle happens, so in the abstract, we can all care about justice until it affects us. And one thing that you said was that people cared about it because it affected their daughters and partners, right? So, that's within their your personal interest, and so I guess my cynicism is about, like, do people really, really care? And isn't it so much easier to say I care about it as long as I don't see the personal downsides for me? And when I do experience the personal downsides, the justice argument or valuing justice is out the window.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. So, I mean, our studies don't give me reason to think that people would be particularly motivated to give socially desirable responses. So, they have to type something in a box, right? And they can say no benefits. Like, it would be very easy for them not to come up with reasons, right? So I certainly think in our qualitative study, well, both really, these aren't people kind of talking at a cocktail party, back in the days when we used to do things like that. I'm not too worried about socially desirable responses in our studies, but I definitely take your point about it's a great idea in the abstract until it personally affects me. Now, I think that's absolutely right, but at the same time, there are some of the more effective forms of affirmative action don't have that zero-sum element to them. So something like providing assistance to people who have been primary caregivers to help them, get back into their research program or something like this. Like, you don't have to offer that just to women. You can offer it to anyone who has, taken time off to care for a child. So you're not favoring women. It's just that probably the vast majority of people who utilize that will be women. But it kind of means that it's not being framed as, here's some resources that's just being given to women, because everyone is entitled to it, just as everyone is entitled to part-time work or flexibility or something like that. Another really sociological analyses of data in the US has shown that some of the very effective forms of affirmative action, basically what they do is they formalize things that tend to happen informally. So things like hearing about opportunities, being mentored. So often that will happen informally, and then you tend to get that kind of homosocial reproduction. So because you have sort of affinities with people who are like you, you tend to mentor and give opportunities to people like you, and then you sort of reproduce this. So when you break that and you formalize these kinds of opportunities, everyone gets mentored, right? So again, you're not singling out women, which often women find like makes them feel like they they need special help, right? Which they find it actually often don't like it. They find it stigmatizing. But this is, you make it for everyone. And again, this doesn't feel like anyone's losing out on anything. There was a great example from a law firm. It's an example described by Iris Bonet, where she went into a law firm, and what they were finding was that at entry level, equal numbers of women and men, lawyers, maybe even more women. But then when it was getting to that this sort of important promotion stage, they were just, they weren't promoting as many women as men, and they're looking at their CVs, and they were just like, we're not being biased here. Just these men on average just are. Their CVs are looking nicer. And it turned out that what was happening is that, of course, the partners in the firm could choose which juniors would work on the glamour projects with them. And they would choose people who reminded them of themselves, like not just that they were men, but they were like also white, or they played the same sport as them, or had gone to the same school, or, so they were just drawn to the people who reminded them of themselves, and then they were giving them opportunities, and then those people's careers took off, right? And other people's didn't. And so what they did is they're just like, we're going to make the project allocation, we're going to formalize that. That's going to happen centrally. It's no longer going to occur through these formal networks. And that was just a way of kind of breaking down this, very unconscious process that was nonetheless, resulting in this cumulative disadvantage for certain people. So things like that, they're all about, anyone, should be able to understand that they're actually just about creating equal opportunities for everyone, as opposed to, pushing down others. But I agree that this is certainly an issue. So there was a large survey done, I think in 2018 in Australia, and I think something like 40%, perhaps it's even more, 40 to 50% of men thought that gender equality initiatives in the workplace, overlooked boys and men. So there's certainly plenty of, and I don't know what, obviously I don't know, this is Australia's different context, but there's certainly some resentment building.
Yeah. And I think, just on the term affirmative action is not, I hate that term personally, because, I'm from Malaysia, and there's a lot of politics there about affirmative action, but, for a different ethnicity. And I'm not of that ethnicity, so I've been on the other end of not receiving what I see are benefits. And I think one thing that you did mention that is important is that constant evaluation, because right now the original targets have already been met of the purpose of the affirmative action policies, but it's maintained because people don't want to give up those benefits. So I think framing it in the way that you did is like, it's not a zero-sum game. It's about that there are certain experiences that maybe women are experiencing more, which affect their work, and if we give opportunities to everyone, that men can take in those assistance, but we know that that's going to affect women more. That's actually going to level the playing field without making it a zero-sum game. So that's a great idea. I've got one quick point, and that was trying to understand people who endorse gender essentialism, and who also want gender balance. Because we're in Asia, so we're like dialectical thinking, the ability to hold two contradictory views, and in Melbourne has a lot of Asians there. And I wonder whether you saw any ethnic differences, that because they're so part of the tradition of a hierarchical patriarchal society that they're perhaps this people gravitate towards that and say, no, there are fundamental differences, but as they're being introduced to more egalitarian democratic values, they're also saying, no, but that also matters. And so now they're having two what seemingly contradictory views, but in their dialectical mindset, they don't see the tension between the two, and just happily endorse them whenever the situation arises.
Right. So we didn't see differences based on ethnicity, but again, our study wasn't really set up very well to explore that variable. But so what I would say is, I actually don't find it so surprising that there are some people who would say, I mean, given that we have this kind of essentialist business case narrative, it would almost be extraordinary if there was like nobody who had bought it, right? And in fact, so sociologists have been tracking gender attitudes, for decades. They use these world value surveys. And what they've found is that they kind of argue that there has actually been this rise of exactly what you describe, this idea of egalitarian essentialism. So as very traditional views have declined over the decades since 1970 or so, they've been replaced by a kind of separate but equal narrative. So So that's not quite what we're seeing, because I think they would say, look, women, what people would say is like, well, of course women should have equal opportunities for advancement, for recruitment, advancement, promotion, training, etc. But it just so happens that they're fundamentally different, and they just won't take them up with the same degree of enthusiasm. So that's what they describe as a kind of egalitarian essentialism. So that's a sort of change from the women are different, so they shouldn't even have these, like, why would we even give them those opportunities? But that's not quite the same as what we're seeing in our data. But again, I don't see it as like, it's not logically contradictory. Like you could say, if it were the case that women and men were fundamentally different, and women had skills that we actually needed in organizations, that it would actually make sense, right? I mean, it's very insulting to men, actually, to say, like, you need a woman on board so that you know how to collaborate. I mean, it's really quite insulting to everyone. But I don't think it's logically inconsistent, which is why it's so interesting that it is relatively rare, I think.
Especially with the empathy thing, and I often get that in psychology, and I point out that the people who started, really spearheaded the field of psychiatry and psychotherapy and psychology and the importance of empathy were men. But all of a sudden in this modern day, we're like, oh, men have no empathy, or like it's all, we see that shift. I was like, I think it's there maybe in this sort of the stereotype of men themselves, as you're saying, it may be insulting to them, and they're not being able to express that side. But it's late, so I should end my discussion. Thank you so much for the talk.
No, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
It doesn't look like any. So I think, watching the time, people are dropping off here. So I'll just thank you very much again, Cordelia. That was a really great talk. I know we all enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone that participated, and please be on the lookout on our social media outlets for all of our other activities. We have another distinguished speaker coming up in September, head of AI and tech banking at DBS. So she'll be joining us then. So thank you all very much, and have a great evening.